Treaties have purpose.
They define.
They forge.
They build.
Treaties are living documents.
They have shaped this province
And this nation.
They shape our way of life.
Treaties affect us all.
We are all treaty people.
The Mi'kmaq are Indian, the Mi'kmaq are First Nation, the Mi'kmaq are Aboriginal, the Mi'kmaq are Indigenous, but we're still Mi'kmaq. We're a nation.
A lot of people, when you think of Canadian history, it's relatively short compared to, the rest of the world. No, it's not, right?
We've been in existence for 13,500 years.
Before European contact, we lived off the land and had access to natural resources, had access to fishing and hunting.
Mi'kmaq ancestors have brokered their own alliances long before European arrival, and many more since. Mi'kmaq had formed the Wabanaki Confederacy with the Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki. Entered into a broader alliance with the Iroquois and the Odawa, alliances that lasted for centuries. Maintained a consistent peace with the French until their displacement by Britain, and even entered into a concordat with the Vatican in 1610.
When we think about treaties and when we try to understand treaties, we have to understand the original spirit and intent of the treaties so that we understand a better perception of history.
Starting in the mid-1700s, British and Mi'kmaq signed a series of treaties which outlined terms of peace and friendship between our peoples based on the mutual goals of cooperation and respect.
All transactions during the late war shall on both sides be buried in oblivion with the hatchet, and that the said Indians shall have all favor, friendship, and protection shown them from this, His Majesty's government.
The treaty isn't just a piece of paper. The treaty was a solemn act. That was a new day. That was the burying of the hatchet.
In return, the Mi'kmaq chief would acknowledge the jurisdiction and dominion of King George over the territories of Nova Scotia.
The common misconception is that the treaties signed away land and resources.
But this is the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. This is the land that we have never gave up. We never surrendered it.
It was signed between the kings and queens of countries in Europe and our people here, and they recognized us as an independent nation.
Nor was this about secession or weakness. Mi'kmaq controlled the land and the coast, and the British needed help to settle and live here safely.
Mi'kmaq were a considerable fighting force at the time when the treaties were signed.
And the Mi'kmaq leaders wanted the establishment of secure and well-regulated trade.
The treaties granted full rights to hunt, fish, and trap anywhere in all of Mi'kmaq.
Respect the land, share the land, and work collectively together.
Alliances, trade, relationships. Essentially, all of these treaties were about two groups willing to share.
So the treaties are the building blocks for our relationship here and for our shared lived experience here. We're all descendants of treaty people, and that means we all have duties and obligations as treaty people.
Since these treaties, there's so many things that happen to Aboriginal people in Canada. And that's why we have things like the blanket ceremony.
The blanket exercise is this interactive tool that illustrates 500 years of colonial history with Europeans and Indigenous peoples.
With the Kairos blanket exercise, we go through a script which discusses the impact of colonization, and so we talk about the issues and the problems that Indigenous people have faced and continue to face.
One of the things that unfortunately happened was that there was an expansion within the British Empire. The entire British Empire grew by about 15 times.
Europeans were coming in, they wanted more permanent settlements here.
The Mi'kmaq traveled with the season where the resources were most plentiful, and the loyalists would come and Mi'kmaq would return to find all of these people taking up their land.
Over time, the balance of power shifted, and attitudes towards Indigenous peoples devolved into one endorsing isolation and cultural genocide.
The issues and the problems that Indigenous people have faced include the 60 scoop, loss of status for women due to the Indian Act, the formation of reserves in general, centralization, residential schools.
Taking children away from their parents and forcing them into schools so that they forget their identity.
My father, he served for two countries, the United States and the Canadian Forces. It was that tough guy, but yet I could see him kind of choke up talking about his experiences in the residential schools.
For years, the Mi'kmaq had to deal with laws that said that they couldn't assemble to talk about their rights, that they couldn't get educated or they'd lose their Indian status, they couldn't get university degrees, they couldn't become lawyers, they couldn't become doctors, or they would lose who they were. The Mi'kmaq couldn't get justice.
It has affected our children and our grandchildren for 7 generations.
Today, we're on these small reserves which make up less than 1% of all of Canada.
We have communities without drinking water. We have some of the highest rates of suicide. When it comes to education, when it comes to health, when it comes to children in care, not only aren't Indigenous people getting over and above what your average Canadian gets, but we're getting 30 to 40% less. 1969, the Union of Nova Scotia Indians got together and began doing the actual research within treaties.
Donald Marshall Jr., when he got caught fishing, he said because of the treaties, we had a right to fish and to sell those fish.
In 1985, James Matthew Simon from the community of Sibiganagati took this issue all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. R.V. Simon was the first federal case in Canada to argue a right based on a treaty. Then the ruling came down.
These treaties demonstrate an enforceable obligation between the Indians and the Crown.
That day was a major turning point for Mi'kmaq rights in Canada.
And there was such joy. It was wonderful.
The magnitude of this decision cannot be understated. Treaties could now shape government policy. They could heavily influence government agendas, and they could have a lasting impact on our communities.
Treaties, they called them the covenant chain. One linked to the other made it stronger. This chain remains unbroken today.
And so that's why we recognize and affirm the treaties each day on October 1st.
Years later, we went fishing with Junior, and I said, wow, this is the man. This is the man that allowed us to fish. I thanked him. Even today, right here. He was a great man. That's what it means.
The Supreme Court decision alone wasn't going to change anything, unless there was a change to people's perceptions.
The majority of Nova Scotians didn't learn about treaties in their history. The majority of Nova Scotians grew up believing that these treaties weren't worth the paper they were written on.
Even on reserve, we didn't have Mi'kmaq courses, we didn't have language courses.
We sort of focused on Indigenous peoples as being here when the first settlers first arrived and then sort of just disappearing off the radar.
I heard about the wigwams that we once lived in, but that was pretty much it, though.
It's a sense of community and the roots to the people's clans. All that was missing.
That's exactly why we need treaty education.
Treaty education is teaching all Canadians on who the Mi'kmaq are, where we've come from, and how we can kind of all move forward together.
Never again will Indigenous history not feel integral to Canadian history. Reconciliation is not an Aboriginal issue. It's a Canadian issue.
We had to get all the stakeholders in the room, the educators, the elders, the youth, the leadership, the people working for government. We said, can we develop a plan for treaty education moving forward? And it was from that we were able to put a comprehensive treaty education strategy in place. Then we were able to advocate and turn that into an MOU between the Mi'kmaq and the province that was signed in 2015.
I've been overwhelmed by the process that has taken place. And I want to say to you very proudly that we are all treaty people.
Nova Scotia has formed a unique provincial and Mi'kmaq partnership to further these and other goals. And together, we're going to promote treaty education in every school, in every provincial government department, and with members of every community across Nova Scotia, not just the Mi'kmaq ones. Treaty education will cover 4 topics.
Who are the Mi'kmaq?
Why are treaties important?
What happened to the treaty relationship?
How can we reconcile our shared history?
Teaching people it's not Indigenous history, it's Canada's history.
And that's a benefit for all people, no matter what their background is.
Treaty education is not just for in the schools, it's for businesses, it's for government, it's for the public sector, it's for everyone.
Our culture is so rich, and there's a lot to be shared.
Our worldview, our Indigenous knowledge, our contributions to Canada.
The knowledge that's been here for thousands and thousands of years has been held by the Mi'kmaq in trust for everyone.
If you want treaty education to succeed, your message cannot be about bitterness, anger, or resentment. Your message has to be about hope and moving forward together.
What needs to happen is we need to be that dream catcher generation. The dream catcher catches the bad dreams and lets the good ones flow through. And a lot of those feelings get passed down through different generations. I want that to stop with me so it doesn't pass on to the next generations.
Reconciliation itself refers to repairing the relationship that is broken. There's a huge strain on the relationship that we have. Both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people need to work together to rebuild that relationship.
We need to build allies. We need to build relationships. We need to focus on the positiveness.
And that's one of the things about sharing, and one of the 7 sacred teachings that Aboriginal people have. It's about sharing and showing respect. And that's what we need to be able to do.
I have a responsibility for the next 7 generations to come. There's a future that we need to change.
What we can do is work with the future for the betterment of all of our children.
Tell our story and move forward for a better way of life for everybody.
Treaties are our way of life.
Your ancestors and my ancestors signed those treaties.
We're all treaty people.
And we're all in this together.